Don't let them hear you, please, the boy whispered without a voice, his fingers clutching the hem of Elena Whitmore's worn dress as if it were the only thing keeping him anchored to the world. Elena froze, her breath catching in her throat as she looked down at him, really looked this time, at the pale, silent child trembling at her side, his wide gray eyes reflecting something deeper than fear, something older, something that didn't belong in a boy no older than 8. And behind him, the laughter came again, low and sharp, cutting through the stillness of the forest clearing like broken glass. 3 young wolves stepping forward with careless confidence, their boots crunching against gravel, their smirks already fixed in place as if this moment had been decided long before she arrived. "There you are," one of them called, his voice light but edged with cruelty. "We were wondering how long you'd hide." Elena felt it then, that familiar instinct curling in her chest, the one that told her to step back, to lower her gaze, to disappear the way she always had, because Omegas like her didn't get involved. They survived by staying small, by staying quiet, by pretending they didn't see the things no one else wanted to stop. But the boy's grip tightened, small fingers shaking, and something in her chest refused to let go. She should have walked away, she knew that. She could have slipped back into the trees, pretended she never heard the laughter, never saw the fear, but instead, her feet moved before her mind could catch up, one step forward, then another, until she stood between them and the child, her arms lifting instinctively, not strong, not threatening, just there, a fragile barrier in a place where barriers rarely held. The wolves paused, surprised for a fraction of a second before amusement returned to their faces. "You?" Another one scoffed, tilting his head as he looked her over. "You think you can stop us?" Elena swallowed, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure they could hear it, but she didn't move, didn't lower her arms, didn't step aside, because the boy hadn't let go, and somehow, that mattered more than the fear pressing in on her ribs. Behind her, she could feel him, still and silent, not trying to run, not even trying to hide, and that was wrong. That was the part that didn't make sense, because any child in his place would have fled the moment someone stepped in, but he stayed, as if he trusted her, or worse, as if he was waiting. "Move," the first wolf said, not loudly, but with enough authority to make most people obey without thinking. Elena's breath hitched, her fingers trembling slightly, but she shook her head, a small motion, barely there, yet it echoed louder than any shout. The forest seemed to hold its breath with her, the wind fading, the distant sounds of birds and rustling leaves falling into an unnatural silence that crept along her skin. For a moment, no one spoke, no one moved, and then the air shifted, subtle at first, like the drop in temperature before a storm, and Elena felt it before she understood it. A weight pressing down from somewhere unseen, ancient and absolute, the kind of presence that didn't need to announce itself because every living thing already knew. The wolves stiffened, their confidence flickering, their gazes darting toward the tree line, as if something beyond sight had suddenly stepped into the clearing, and Elena's pulse stuttered, her senses sharpening, her body caught between fear and something else she couldn't name, something that made her want to turn around, to look behind her, but she didn't. She stayed exactly where she was, arms still raised, standing, where even stronger wolves would have stepped aside, because the boy behind her hadn't moved, and somehow, that mattered more than the way the world itself seemed to shift around them. The silence did not break all at once, it unraveled slowly, like something unseen pulling the threads of the world tighter and tighter until even the smallest movement felt too loud. And Elena realized she was no longer just standing in a clearing, she was standing inside a moment that did not belong to her, the kind of moment stories were built around, the kind that decided who mattered and who did not. One of the wolves shifted his weight, forcing a laugh that sounded thinner than before. "What is this?" he muttered, glancing over his shoulder, some kind of trick, but even he did not sound convinced, and Elena could see it now, the uncertainty creeping into their posture, the way their shoulders stiffened, the way their eyes kept searching the trees as if expecting something to step out at any second. Her own breath came shallow, uneven, the air feeling heavier with each passing second, pressing against her chest until it was almost difficult to inhale, and still, she did not move, because the boy had not moved, his fingers still clutching her dress, his presence steady in a way that made no sense for someone so small, so quiet, so calm. That was when she felt it. Not a sound, not a movement, but a presence behind her, close enough to change the way the air touched her skin, close enough that every instinct in her body screamed for her to turn around. But something deeper, something quieter, told her not to, told her to stay exactly where she was, to hold the line she had drawn even if she did not understand why it mattered. The wolves felt it too, because one by one, they took a step back, not in panic, not in retreat, but in something closer to instinct, like prey that had suddenly remembered what it meant to be hunted. "We should go," one of them said under his breath, his voice barely carrying, and the others did not argue. They did not mock him this time, because whatever had entered the clearing had already decided the outcome, whether they understood it or not. Elena's pulse hammered in her ears, her thoughts scattering as the weight behind her grew sharper, more defined, until it was impossible to ignore. And then, finally, the boy moved, not away, not to hide, but forward, his small hand slipping from her dress as he stepped out from behind her, and Elena's breath caught, her arms lowering instinctively as she turned just enough to see him, just enough to realize that he was no longer trembling, no longer shrinking into himself. He stood straight, chin lifted, slightly, his gaze fixed on something behind her with a quiet certainty that sent a chill down her spine. For a single heartbeat, nothing happened, and then Elena heard it, a voice, low and controlled, not raised, not harsh, but carrying a weight that made the entire clearing seem to bow around it. "You should not have come here alone." The words were not directed at her, not at the wolves, but at the boy, and something in the tone, something almost imperceptible, shifted the air again, softer this time, but no less powerful. Elena turned fully then, unable to stop herself, and what she saw stole the breath from her lungs, not because of fear, but because of the presence standing only a few feet away, tall, still, his dark coat unmoving despite the faint breeze, his silver eyes fixed entirely on the child, not glancing at the others, not acknowledging the wolves who now stood frozen in place, as if they had already been forgotten. The boy took another step forward, and for the first time, Elena saw something she had not expected, not fear, not hesitation, but recognition, and something dangerously close to trust. And in that moment, Elena understood one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever she had just stepped into, whatever line she had crossed by refusing to walk away, it was no longer something she could simply leave behind. The man did not move at first, and somehow that stillness carried more authority than any command Elena had ever heard, as if the world itself had decided to wait for him, as if every breath in the clearing now belonged to him alone. His gaze remained on the boy, unwavering, searching, and there was something in his expression that Elena could not name, not softness, not relief, but something deeper, something held tightly beneath control, like a storm contained behind glass. The boy stopped a few feet away from him, his small shoulders squared in a way that felt too deliberate for his age, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other, no words spoken, no sound breaking the fragile quiet. Yet the space between them felt full, charged with a connection Elena could feel but not understand. Then the man exhaled, slow and measured, and lowered himself to one knee, the movement deliberate, undeniable, and every wolf in the clearing reacted as if struck by the same invisible force. Back straightening, heads lowering without instruction, because no one needed to be told what that gesture meant. Elena's heart stumbled in her chest, her breath catching as realization brushed the edges of her thoughts, not fully formed, not yet accepted, but impossible to ignore, because no ordinary man commanded that kind of response. No ordinary presence bent the world so completely. "You are safe now," he said quietly, and though the words were simple, they carried a weight that settled into the ground itself, steady and absolute. The boy's fingers twitched at his sides, and then, slowly, he lifted his hand, not speaking, not making a sound, but reaching forward with a familiarity that made Elena's pulse quicken, as if this was not their first meeting, as if this was something that had been interrupted rather than begun. The man's expression shifted then, only slightly, but enough that Elena felt it like a change in the air, and when he spoke again, his voice lowered further, meant only for the child. I should have come sooner. The words were controlled, but there was something beneath them, something that did not belong to a king, something almost human in its weight, and Elena felt a strange tightness in her chest at the sound of it. Behind her, one of the wolves shifted, the faint scrape of his boot against the ground breaking the stillness just enough to remind everyone else they were still there, still watching, still trying to understand what they had stepped into. And that was when the man's gaze finally moved, lifting from the boy and settling, not on Elena, not yet, but on the others, and the change was immediate, like the closing of a door, like warmth being replaced by something colder, sharper, final. No words followed, none were needed, because the message was already clear in the way the wolves lowered their heads further, in the way they took another step back without being told, their earlier confidence gone, replaced by something closer to instinctive respect, or fear, or both. Elena stood, frozen, her thoughts racing, her body caught between the urge to step back and the inability to move at all, because now that she saw him, really saw him, there was no denying it, the presence, the authority, the way the world seemed to shift around him. It all pointed to a truth she had only ever heard in whispers, in stories told from a distance, never meant to be experienced this close, this real. And then, finally, his gaze found her, silver eyes steady, unreadable, and for the first time since he arrived, Elena felt the full weight of his attention, not crushing, not threatening, but impossible to ignore, as if he was measuring something she could not see, as if he was trying to understand why she was still standing there, why she had not stepped aside when every instinct should have told her to do exactly that. And in that moment, Elena realized with a quiet, unsettling certainty that whatever happened next would not only change the boy's fate, but hers as well. Elena could not look away from those eyes, not because they demanded it, but because something in them refused to release her, as if the moment itself had narrowed to a single point where only truth could exist, and she became suddenly aware of everything she was, everything she was not, the worn fabric of her dress, the dust on her boots, the quiet insignificance she had carried her entire life like a second skin. And yet she was still standing there, still holding her ground in front of a presence that made even seasoned wolves lower their gaze without question. Her throat tightened as she tried to steady her breathing, her pulse still racing from everything that had just unfolded, but she did not step back, not yet, because something in the way he looked at her did not feel like judgment. It felt like assessment, like he was searching for an answer only she could give without even knowing the question. The boy moved again, drawing closer to the man, his small hand lifting with quiet certainty until it hovered near the man's arm. And for a brief moment, Elena thought he might hesitate, might pull back, but instead, his fingers closed around the dark fabric of the man's coat, and the contact was simple, almost ordinary, yet it carried a weight that shifted the air once more. The man's gaze softened, just slightly, not enough for most to notice, but Elena saw it, felt it, the tension in his posture easing in a way that spoke louder than any declaration. And when he placed his hand gently over the boy's, it was not a gesture of authority, but of acknowledgement, of something that had already been decided long before this moment. "You were told to stay within the inner grounds," he said quietly, the words firm but not harsh, and the boy lowered his head just a fraction, not in fear, but in understanding, as if he accepted the reprimand without resistance. Behind them, the wolves remained silent, their earlier bravado gone, replaced by a rigid stillness that bordered on reverence, and Elena could feel their attention shifting, not toward the man, but toward the boy, as realization began to settle in pieces, incomplete but undeniable. Her own thoughts struggled to catch up, fragments of stories, of whispered rumors about the northern territories, about a ruler whose presence alone could silence a room, about a lineage guarded more fiercely than any border. And suddenly, the way the boy had stood, the way he had not run, the way he had looked at the man without fear, it all aligned into something that made her breath falter. The man finally straightened, rising to his full height with effortless control, and the subtle shift in his posture sent another ripple through the clearing, a silent confirmation of what no one had yet dared to say aloud. And when he spoke again, his voice carried just enough to reach everyone present, measured, precise, leaving no space for doubt. You will return, he said to the wolves without looking at them. And you will forget this place. The command was not loud, not forceful, yet it settled over them like an unbreakable law, and one by one, they nodded, their heads lowering further before they began to step away, not hurried, not chaotic, but with the quiet urgency of those who understood they had already been granted more mercy than they deserved. Elena remained where she was, her hands slowly lowering to her sides, as the tension in the air began to ease. But the weight of the moment did not leave her. It lingered, pressing against her thoughts, reshaping everything she believed she understood about her place in the world, because she had stepped forward without thinking, had chosen to stand when every instinct told her to disappear. And now, she stood in front of something that could not be undone. The man's attention returned to her then, fully this time, no longer divided, no longer distant, and the boy remained at his side, his small hand still holding onto the edge of that dark coat as if it belonged there, as if it always had. And Elena felt it again, that quiet, undeniable shift, the sense that whatever had just been revealed was only the beginning, not the end, and that somehow, without meaning to, she had already become a part of it. Elena became aware of her own hands then, how they had slowly fallen to her sides without her noticing, how her fingers still trembled faintly as if her body had not yet caught up with the reality unfolding in front of her, and she forced herself to take a breath, steady and quiet, though the air still felt different here, heavier, as if it carried something unseen that lingered even after the others had gone. The clearing was no longer tense in the same way, but it was not calm either. It was something else entirely, something that felt like the space after a storm had passed, where everything looked the same but nothing truly was. Her gaze shifted to the boy again, to the way he stood beside the man without hesitation, his small frame relaxed now, no longer braced for impact. And there was a change in him that Elena could not ignore, not just in his posture, but in the quiet certainty that seemed to settle around him, as if the fear she had seen before had only been a surface layer, something temporary that had already begun to fade. She realized then that she did not even know his name, that she had stepped into his defense without knowing anything about him except the look in his eyes, and somehow, that felt more important now than it had a moment ago. The man turned slightly, just enough that his full attention settled on her again, and Elena felt it immediately, that same steady, searching gaze that did not press or demand, but still left no space to hide. And for the first time since he had arrived, she felt the urge to speak, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but because the silence between them seemed to be waiting for something. He was alone, she said quietly, her voice softer than she expected, but steady. They were not going to stop. The words felt simple, almost insufficient compared to everything that had just happened, but they were the truth, the only thing she could offer without overthinking it. The man studied her for a moment longer, and though his expression did not change, there was a subtle shift in the air between them, something that felt like acknowledgement, not of her words, but of her choice, of the fact that she had stepped forward when she did not have to. The boy's hand tightened slightly against the man's coat, and then, slowly, he turned his head toward Elena, his gray eyes meeting hers again, and this time, there was no fear in them at all, only a quiet awareness, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time, as if he understood what she had done in a way that did not need to be spoken. Elena felt a warmth rise in her chest at that look, unexpected and unfamiliar, and she found herself offering a small, tentative smile before she could stop herself, a gesture so instinctive it caught her off guard. The man noticed it. She was certain of that, because his gaze flickered briefly toward the boy before returning to her, and when he spoke, his voice carried that same calm authority. But now there was something else beneath it, something quieter, almost reflective. You placed yourself between them and him, he said, not as a question, not as a challenge, but as a simple statement of fact. And Elena nodded once, unsure what else to say, because there was no explanation beyond what she had already given. For a moment, neither of them spoke again, and the silence returned, but it was no longer tense, no longer uncertain. It felt measured, deliberate, as if it was part of something larger that was still unfolding. Then the man took a step closer, not abruptly, not in a way that threatened, but with a controlled ease that drew the distance between them into something more intentional, and Elena felt her breath catch again, not out of fear this time, but because the space between them now felt significant, like a threshold she had unknowingly approached. Most would have turned away, he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. You did not. And there was no judgment in his tone, no praise either, just a quiet recognition that settled deeper than either. And Elena realized then that this was not about what had happened in the clearing alone. This was about what it revealed, about what he had seen in her that she had never thought mattered. And for the first time in her life, she felt the weight of being truly noticed, not as something small or insignificant, but as someone whose choice had changed the course of a moment that could not be taken back. Elena did not realize she had been holding her breath until it finally left her in a slow, unsteady exhale, the weight of his words settling deeper than she expected, not because they were loud or commanding, but because they were simple, undeniable, and spoken as if they carried meaning far beyond the moment itself. She lowered her gaze briefly, not in submission, but in an instinctive attempt to steady herself, to gather the scattered pieces of her thoughts that refused to settle, because nothing about this felt ordinary anymore. Not the clearing, not the boy, not the man standing before her whose presence seemed to shape the very air. When she looked up again, her eyes moved to the boy, drawn by a quiet shift she could not ignore, and she saw him watching her with the same steady focus, his expression unreadable but not distant, as if he was trying to understand her in the same way the man had, as if her choice had marked her in some way she could not yet see. The silence stretched, but it no longer felt empty. It felt intentional, like a pause that carried meaning. And then the man turned slightly toward the boy, his posture easing just enough to create a subtle difference in the space between them, one that felt almost protective, though nothing about him suggested weakness. You will return with me, he said quietly, his tone leaving no room for argument, and the boy did not hesitate, did not resist. He simply nodded once, the movement small but certain, as if this had always been the outcome, as if everything that had happened before was only a path leading back to this point. Elena felt something shift in her chest at that, something she could not name, a mix of relief and something quieter, something that felt like loss, though she did not understand why, because she had only just met him, only just stepped into his world for a brief moment, and yet it felt like she was already being pulled out of it. The man's attention returned to her once more, and this time, there was no distance in his gaze, no separation between observer and observed. It was direct, deliberate, and Elena felt it settle over her like something tangible. What is your name? He asked, and though the question was simple, it carried a weight that made her straighten slightly, her spine aligning without conscious thought, because this was not a casual inquiry. This was something more, something that acknowledged her presence in a way she had never experienced before. Elena, she answered, her voice steady despite the way her pulse quickened again. Elena Whitmore. And for a brief moment, she wondered if her name would mean anything to him, if it would pass through his thoughts as something insignificant, something easily forgotten. But he did not look away, did not dismiss it. He held it there, as if committing it to memory, as if it mattered. The boy shifted again, his hand loosening slightly from the man's coat before lifting toward Elena, not fully reaching, not quite letting go either, a quiet, uncertain motion that seemed to bridge the space between them without words. And Elena felt that same warmth rise again, stronger this time, something that made her take a small step forward before she could stop herself. Their distance closed by only a few inches, but it felt like more, like crossing an invisible line that had been drawn long before she understood it existed. And for a moment, everything else faded, the forest, the silence, even the weight of the man's presence, leaving only the quiet connection that had formed between her and the child she had chosen not to abandon. The man watched it all without interruption, his expression unreadable. But there was no mistaking the awareness in his gaze, the way he observed not just what was happening, but what it meant. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, more deliberate, carrying something that felt almost like a decision being made in real time. You will not be forgotten for this, he said, and the words lingered in the air, heavier than anything that had come before. Not a promise, not a reward, but something else entirely, something that hinted at a future Elena had never imagined, one that had already begun the moment she chose to stand her ground. And as she stood there, caught between what she had always known and what was now unfolding, she realized with quiet certainty that there was no returning to who she had been before this clearing, before this moment, before him. Elena felt the words settle into her like something permanent, not loud, not overwhelming, but undeniable, as if they had found a place within her that had always been empty, waiting without her knowing. And for a moment she did not know how to respond, because nothing in her life had prepared her for this, for being seen, for being remembered by someone whose presence alone reshaped the world around him. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides, grounding herself in the small, familiar sensation as her thoughts struggled to keep pace with what was unfolding, and she found herself looking once more at the boy, at the way he still stood close, not clinging now, but choosing to remain, his quiet presence steady and certain in a way that felt almost deliberate. He lifted his gaze to her again, and this time, there was something new there, something softer, something that did not need words to be understood, and Elena felt her chest tighten gently at the realization that whatever connection had formed between them in those brief moments had not disappeared. It had only shifted, becoming something quieter but no less real. The man stepped forward then, not breaking the space between them abruptly, but closing it with measured intent, and Elena became acutely aware of the difference in their presence, the way he carried weight without effort, the way even the smallest movement seemed to ripple outward, touching everything around him. Elena Whitmore, he repeated, her name spoken with a calm precision that made it feel different, as if it held more meaning now than it ever had before, and she felt a subtle warmth rise again at the sound of it, unexpected and unfamiliar. You stood when there was no reason to stand, he continued, his gaze steady, and you remained when leaving would have been easier. There was no accusation in his tone, no challenge, only recognition, and somehow that made it harder to respond, because she did not see it the way he did. She had not thought of it as strength, only as something she could not ignore. I did not think, she admitted quietly, her voice softer now, more honest than she intended. I just could not walk away. The words felt simple, almost insufficient, but they were the truth, and for a moment, the silence returned again, not empty, but reflective, as if her answer had been weighed and understood without needing to be expanded. The boy shifted slightly beside him, his hand lifting once more, this time reaching fully toward Elena, stopping just short of touching her, and she hesitated only for a second before raising her own hand to meet his, her fingers brushing lightly against his in a gesture that felt both fragile and certain, and in that brief contact, she felt it again, that quiet sense of connection, something that did not rely on words or explanation, something that simply existed. The man watched the exchange without interruption, his expression unchanged, but there was a depth in his gaze now that had not been there before, something that suggested this moment mattered in ways Elena could not yet understand. You protected what is mine, he said after a pause, his voice lower, more deliberate, and the weight of those words settled differently than the ones before, because they carried implication, not just acknowledgement, and Elena felt her breath catch slightly as she realized what he was truly saying, not just about the boy, but about the line she had crossed without knowing it. She did not respond immediately, because there was nothing simple to say in return, nothing that could match the gravity of what had just been placed in front of her, and so she stood there, her hand still lightly touching the boy's, her gaze steady despite the quiet storm building in her thoughts. The forest seemed to exhale around them, the tension that had once filled the clearing now replaced by something calmer, something more controlled, as if the moment had reached a point of decision, and Elena sensed it. The shift from uncertainty to intention, from reaction to consequence. The man turned slightly then, his attention moving between her and the boy, and when he spoke again, it carried a finality that settled into the ground beneath them. You will come with us, he said, not as a demand, not as a command that required force, but as something already decided, something that did not ask for permission because it understood its own inevitability. And Elena felt the weight of those words more than anything that had come before, because this was no longer about a moment in a clearing. This was about everything that would follow, everything that could not be undone. And as she stood there, caught between the life she had known and the one now unfolding before her, she realized with a quiet, steady certainty that she was already stepping forward, even before her feet moved, even before she spoke, because some choices, once made, carried you the rest of the way whether you were ready or not. Elena felt the weight of his words echo through her long after they were spoken, not because of the authority behind them, but because of how easily they settled into place, as if some part of her had already accepted them before her mind could catch up, and she realized with a quiet, steady clarity that she had not asked what would happen next, had not questioned where they would go or why she had been chosen to follow, because the answer was already there in the way the moment had unfolded. In the way the boy still stood close, his presence no longer uncertain, no longer hidden. Her hand remained near his, not quite touching now, but close enough that she could feel the faint warmth of it, a silent reminder that this had begun with something simple, a choice made without thinking, and yet it had led her here, standing at the edge of a life she did not recognize. The man turned, his movement smooth and deliberate, and the shift in his posture seemed to signal something unseen, something beyond the clearing itself, because Elena felt it again, that subtle change in the air, as if the world beyond the trees had been waiting for this moment to begin. The boy stepped forward without hesitation, falling into place at his side, with a quiet certainty that spoke of familiarity, of belonging, and Elena watched them for a brief second, her chest tightening with a feeling she could not fully name, something between hesitation and resolve, because this was the point where she could still step back, still choose to remain where she was, to return to the life that had always been hers, small and predictable, untouched by the weight of whatever this was. But even as the thought formed, it faded just as quickly, because she knew, without needing to say it aloud, that there was no real choice left, not after what she had seen, not after what she had done. Her feet moved before she could reconsider, one step forward, then another, closing the distance not just between herself and them, but between who she had been and who she was becoming. And though her heart still beat fast, it was no longer driven by fear. It was something steadier now, something that felt like quiet acceptance. The man glanced at her as she joined them, his gaze brief but deliberate, acknowledging her presence without question, without surprise, as if he had expected nothing less. And that simple recognition settled something inside her that she had not realized was unsettled. They began to walk then, not hurried, not tense, but with a calm that felt almost unnatural after everything that had just happened. And Elena became aware of the forest again. The way the trees seemed to part just enough to allow their passage, the way the silence followed them rather than resisting them, as if even the land understood who walked among it. The boy remained close, his steps quiet, his presence steady, and after a few moments, he turned his head slightly toward her, his gray eyes meeting hers once more. And this time, there was no question in them, no uncertainty, only a quiet acknowledgement that she was part of this now, that she had crossed the same line he had, whether she understood it or not. Elena felt a small, unexpected smile touch her lips in return, a reflection of something she could not yet define, but did not try to resist, because for the first time, the unknown did not feel like something to fear. It felt like something she was meant to step into. The man slowed slightly then, just enough that his voice could carry without effort. And when he spoke, it was not to command, not to explain, but to state something that felt as certain as everything else that had come before. From this moment forward, you walk under my protection. The words settled around her, not heavy, not overwhelming, but firm, unshakable. And Elena felt them take root in a way she had never experienced before, because protection had never been something promised to her, never something she had expected to receive. She did not respond immediately, because there was no need to. The meaning was already clear, already understood, and as they continued forward, leaving the clearing behind without looking back, Elena realized that whatever waited ahead, whatever this path would demand of her, she was no longer walking it alone, and for the first time, that truth felt stronger than any fear she might have carried with her. The path stretched ahead of them in quiet certainty, winding through the forest as if it had always been meant to lead here. and Elena found herself noticing the smallest details now. The soft crunch of leaves beneath her boots, the steady rhythm of her breathing, the way the air no longer felt heavy with tension but carried something calmer, something that felt like the beginning of a different kind of silence. She walked a few steps behind them at first, not out of hesitation, but out of instinct, giving space to what she still did not fully understand. And yet the distance never felt like separation, because the presence of the man ahead of her remained constant, anchoring everything around them with a quiet, unshakable force. The boy stayed close to him, his steps light but purposeful, and every so often, he glanced back, not with uncertainty, but with a quiet awareness that she was still there, still following, and each time their eyes met, Elena felt that same subtle warmth, a connection that had not faded with movement, but had settled into something steady and real. The trees began to thin gradually, the dense cover of the forest opening just enough to reveal a faint glow ahead, not bright, not overwhelming, but steady, like a promise waiting just beyond reach. And Elena felt her steps slow slightly as she took it in, her thoughts catching up to what her instincts had already accepted, that she was being led somewhere she had never been, somewhere few like her were ever meant to see. The man stopped just at the edge of that light, his silhouette framed by it, and for a moment, everything stilled again, not tense, not uncertain, but deliberate, as if this pause marked a boundary between what had been and what was about to begin. He turned then, his gaze moving first to the boy, lingering for a brief second before shifting to Elena, and in that look, there was no distance left, no sense of her being an outsider or an observer, only a quiet acknowledgement that she had already crossed into something that could not be undone. From here on, he said, his voice calm but carrying clearly through the still air, you will not stand behind. The words were simple, but they carried a meaning that settled deeply, reshaping the space between them, and Elena felt it immediately, the shift from following to belonging, from observing to being part of what was unfolding. Her breath caught softly, not in fear, but in recognition, because this was not just about where she stood physically, it was about where she now stood in relation to everything she had known before, and for a moment, she hesitated, not because she doubted, but because she understood the weight of what was being offered. The boy stepped forward again, moving past the man this time, his small figure crossing into the soft glow without hesitation, and he turned back once more, his gray eyes meeting Elena's. With that same quiet certainty, as if inviting her forward without needing to speak, Elena felt her feet move again, steady, deliberate, closing the final distance until she stood beside them, no longer behind, no longer apart. And as she stepped into the light, she felt it fully, the shift that had been building since the moment she chose not to walk away, the quiet transformation that had taken place without her noticing until now. The man watched her for a brief moment, his gaze steady, and then he gave a slight nod, not dramatic, not ceremonial, but enough to mark the moment as something real, something acknowledged, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a finality that felt both grounding and expansive at the same time. You stood for what others ignored, he said, and that choice will follow you further than you can yet see. The words lingered, not as a warning, not as a promise alone, but as something in between, something that stretched forward into a future she could not yet imagine. Elena did not look back, not at the forest, not at the place where everything had begun, because she knew with quiet certainty that there was nothing left for her there.